Well, someone asked me why I think Arch Linux is overrated, and this is just my opinion, of course. You may not think that, and I'm explaining why I think Arch Linux is overrated. I probably run Arch Linux longer than most of the people watching this video right now have been using Linux. I probably run Arch Linux as my main system longer than that. Up till around 2015, I was alternating between Arch Linux and SUSE Linux and just random distributions, but I was a heavy Arch user, and my first proper install of Arch Linux when I decided to really get into Arch Linux was on a 2008 iMac. So I installed Arch Linux in 2008 for the first time, and basically ran it almost not non-stop, but I was either dual booting that with Windows or with other Linux distributions. But I kind of was running Arch Linux primarily from 2008 to 2015, also while testing out other distributions on other computers and using other distributions for a month here and 2 months there and stuff like that. But it was my primary system from 2008 and upwards for when we're talking Linux. Like I said, I still used Windows also because of gaming and all that fucking shit, But when Arch Linux came out, I think in 2004, I followed Arch Linux, or was it 2003? I can't remember. I always followed Arch Linux since it came out. Watching what people were talking about it, what was going on with it, and stuff like that. And I actually think I did some health installs of Arch Linux. Looking at the Arch wiki and installing it before 2008. But I never ran it. I just installed it and okay, now it's up and running, and then install another distribution. So I did the Arch installation process before 2008, but in 2008 on my iMac back then that was when I installed Arch Linux and used Arch Linux more than just installing it. So I called it my first properly installed Arch Linux install, because rest of the times, sometimes I just did health, did the partitioning, and they were like, this is boring, and then I installed some other PC Linux OS or MIPS Linux or MIPS Linux or what they were called, and DPOS or what the fuck, all kind of distributions. It was just, I just didn't see a need for it. I was not that hyped about Arch Linux back then. But when I got it installed into my iMac and I messed around with it, I was like, this is actually really neat. And back then, when Arch Linux came out, and I would say up to like 2015-ish, maybe a little bit later, you had benefits of running Arch, other than choosing your own software that you install with the distribution, which in my opinion is the only benefit that you get from running Arch Linux, is that you decide what software that you are running. Because if you benchmark Arch up against other distribution, it's not really the king of speed. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's slower. Depends on what you're doing. It may be a little bit fast, like 1% or 0.5% or 2% faster in this area, but then it's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5% slower in this area. It may be good at rendering, but it's bad at file works, hard drives and file searches and stuff like that. And today there are a lot of workloads where distributions like Debian Stable and Leap and Tumbleweed and Ubuntu is demolishing fucking Arch. Like SQL searches, I think, is one where the last time I looked, again, granted it was last year in 2021, Ubuntu was the king. And you would be like, oh, but I don't do SQL searches. Fine, don't, It was Arch Linux nowadays, when we're talking from a performance standpoint, if it's faster, it's really rare that it's that fast that you will actually noticing it. It will be like if I set you down in front of a computer and I blindfolded you, and I played a game in 60 FPS in front of you, and I blindfolded you again and set it up to run as 65 or 70 FPS, and I let you play it, you could not see the difference. You could not notice the difference at all. It's impossible. You could from 30 to 60, 60. Probably also from 60 to 90 or 100 frames per second. You can now see it different and feel it different. And that is where Linux distributions sit today, where one specific distribution may be a little bit faster. It's either not enough for you to noticing it on a daily basis, unless that, let's say Arch Linux is, let's say, 5 seconds faster rendering a video than Ubuntu is, or even fucking 20 seconds faster. That really don't matter that much if you're only rendering 1 or 2 videos a day. But if you're rendering hundreds of videos, 10 videos a day, now we're starting to talk about it. You get what I'm saying here? So most people would not feel that big of a difference between running Arch and other Linux distributions, if even at all. And again, Arch could even be slower in some instances than other distributions, but it's so negligible that it's mostly not noticeable. And when people are telling me that, oh, I could definitely feel a speed bump from running Arch versus named distribution, I'm a little bit skeptic. I'm like, yeah, don't you just think that's the placebo effect, where you want it to be true, so therefore you see it like that? I'm not saying it is not the case, because it also depends on hardware still with Linux. You know, some hardware, if you have the right hardware combination, some distributions that have specific kernels can have problems with that hardware, where Arch Linux that always are on the newest kernel and stuff like that, and newest drivers could have a little bit of a benefit there. So I'm not saying that it's never the case. I'm just saying that 99% of people will not notice a difference at all. It's just, it comes down to, you have the control over installing your hardware. Your software. You pick and choose every little component of your software that that is getting installed. But that is not even that special anymore, because if you're running OpenSUSE in their Yast installer, you can do the exact same thing. You just have to know how to get there, which is a little bit complicated. But if you use the Yast installer, you can also pick and choose every little piece of software that's going to be installed on that system. There are Debian ways you can do it. I think there's even Ubuntu ways where you can do the exact same thing. Arch Linux is just the one that's mostly known for be doing that. And I would say Arch Linux don't give you a choice if you're installing it the Arch way. You have to pick and choose. Where under Tumbleweed and the other distributions, they kind of prefer you to just go with the pre-selected sets of packages. But they give the option that if you really want to fine-tune it, you have to go into some sub-menus, and now you have access to fine-tuning your system. Another benefit that Arch have is the rolling release cycle. But again, we have a lot of distributions that are rolling releases also. We have Solus, Tumbleweed, and now we have Ubuntu Rhino, if that's ever take off properly. And some would debate that even Debian testing to some extent could be a rolling release. There are still people believing that Fedora is a rolling release when it's not. We also have Arch, Manjaro, that's a rolling release. And we have other, KAOS, I think, is also a rolling release. So that it's not even that beneficial to have a rolling release anymore, because it's not like the only boy in town. Like when Arch Linux came out, it was one of the only distributions that were a rolling release nature. When Arch Linux came out, it was also one of the few distributions where you could select all your software. Then we are talking about customizability. If you cannot customize each and every Linux distribution at your command, you don't know Linux. Because the way you can customize Arch Linux, you can customize any Linux distribution. It's just, again, not set up to be done like that from the beginning. So let's take Ubuntu, for example, or SUSE Leap, OpenSUSE Leap, if you're not customizing it under the installation process. You have to now go and take stuff out, go into config files and edit them and all of that shit. Where Arch Linux kind of from the get-go, again, if you're installing it the Arch way, if you from the get-go go in and then, it wants you to fiddle around in config files and stuff like that. So that's a kind of a benefit there, if you want to say it like that it kind of forces you to get into config files and customize your system out of the bat. But it's not something that Arch Linux is the only one that have that capability. Then we are talking about the latest and greatest. You're always getting the latest software. Well, again, Tumbleweed, to some extent, Fedora, to some extent Debian testing. They are soulless. There's so many fucking distributions where you get the latest and greatest. You may not get it as fast as Arch, and sometimes Tumbleweed is faster than Arch to give you the latest and greatest. They may be a little bit more stable because they test their software a little bit more than Arch do. Or customize their software a little bit more than Arch do to make sure that it functions within the ecosystem. So they need a little bit more testing, or they need to be a little bit more conservative of when they are upgrading, to make sure that most of the bugs is already being ironed out from the developers, the upstream developers. But again, like I said back in the day, Arch Linux was one of the few distributions, like really few distributions, that gave you the latest and greatest. And nowadays, and they did that back in the day also, but especially nowadays, when we are talking hardware support in the kernel, it don't matter what kernel you're running, because the developers can backport hardware support from a newer kernel into an older kernel. So if you're running 5.15, you are probably running the same hardware support and hardware drivers that are in 5.18 right now. You may lose on, let's say, some memory management feature that are in 5.18. That may not be backported into 5.15, but you can still run on the same hardware. That's why you can run a system like Debian Stable, OpenSUSE Leap, and stuff like that. You can run that on modern hardware because they take the hardware from the newer kernel and put into the old kernel. You're not really getting a lot of the benefits with Arch Linux as you did back in the day, because when Arch Linux, like up till 2010 or 15, Arch Linux was their distribution that was rolling. It was their distribution for speed and customizability, and it was their distribution if you want a slim, streamlined install. It's not anymore. Some people say, oh, well, we get the benefit of the AUR. Kinda. But where do most of that software comes from? It's a lot of it is just a deb file that's converted, or an RPM file that's being converted. So that means that if you're running any RPM distribution or deb distribution, you have access to the same software. I would even debate to say that RPM formats and deb formats have access to a bigger selection of software than the AUR have. And better maintained software, because a lot of times with the AUR, you get into problems where they are flagged for outdated. You get into security problems. You have to read up of bug problems with each and every fucking little program. I remember one fucking dude talking about Arch Linux. I was like, if you're using the AUR, it's your job to make sure that you read the, the comments of, if you go onto the AUR, you can read what other people are talking about for each package. And it's your duty to keep track of what's going on with each package, so you can see if there's any problems with it. Because it don't go out and say it by itself that there's a problem with the program. You have to figure it out for yourself. So that means that if you're installing 5, 10, 100 programs from the AUR, you have to keep track of what's going on in the dev talk and stuff like that under the AUR packages. For those AUR packages. Who the fuck have time for that? The AUR is not a benefit. Even no matter if you're using chaotic or what the fuck it's called. Because under Ubuntu you have PPAs. Under SUSE you have their software portal that's kind of their version of PPAs. And you go on to other distributions, they also have their own third-party ways of getting software. So if you can get it under Arch, you can probably get it under any other Linux distribution. So that's not even a benefit anymore. Another one here is that, and I find this really, really interesting, is that people, they still to this day say, oh, if you run Arch Linux, you learn about your hardware. No, you don't. You don't. Because the only thing you learn about your hardware is that you learn to figure out what hardware you have on your system. That's not learning about hardware. That's learning how to probe your hardware on your system. You don't learn about graphic cards by running Arch. You don't learn about how they are built, what, why components are where they are on a graphic card and stuff like that. That's learning about graphic cards. The PCP, the capacitors, why they are set up the way they are with their GPU and all of that fucking shit. You don't learn anything about that. You learn to say, hey, Linux kernel, what graphic card is connected to you right now? Hey user, this is the graphic card that's connected to me right now. Arch Wiki, what driver should I use? User, you should use this driver. Thank you, Arch Linux. Let me copy paste this into the terminal. That's to the extent you learn about hardware. So not even that is a benefit anymore. And you can learn this on any Linux distribution. If you want to learn how to probe Linux, what hardware you have, you can do that on any Linux distribution. Another thing is that, and this is also kind of the same nature here, is that, oh well, you learn Linux by running Arch Linux. No. And a lot of people say that is that they justify that by running the Arch, installing Arch the Arch way. If you install Arch Linux the Arch way, what you learn in that process is how Calamaris work. You learn how Ubiquity work. You learn how any Linux installer works, because what you're doing with installing Arch the Arch way is the same shit that Calamaris is doing in the backend while you're doing the GUI things, and the same thing that Ubiquity is doing while you're doing your GUI things. Not 100% because Ubuntu works in a different way than Arch, but setting up your logos and stuff like that, respectively how they do it under Ubuntu versus Arch, of course. But you just learn how an installer works. If you really want to learn Linux, you can do that on any Linux distribution you are running. You don't have to run Arch. It's not exclusively to Arch that you can learn about Linux under Arch. You can do that on any Linux distribution. I'm not saying Arch is a bad system. I'm just saying that Arch is a system for people that have a specific need. If you want to have total control over your software from the start, from the second you start to install your Linux install, if you want to have total control over your system and make the decision about everything, it's one of those distributions that can do that for you. If you want to make sure that you have an as less loaded install as possible by default, that's one of the distributions that can do that for you. But that's it. That's all it brings to the table. There are other distributions that do all of these things also, but Arch is probably one of them that do it the best with the customizability aspect of it. Back in the day, Arch Linux had a lot of benefits that no other you could not get anywhere else. Nowadays, it's kind of just run-of-the-mill. It's a run-of-the-mill Linux distribution. You see that by how people are using Arch Linux. You rarely see people install Arch Linux the Arch way. So they are running Arch like you're running any other Linux distribution. That's how people run Ubuntu. That's how people run Debian. That's how people run OpenSUSE. They install it with the pre-selected packages and customizing and setting it up. So you're not really like getting the benefits of Arch that much. So a lot of the benefits that Arch Linux had in the past, it don't really have anymore. So that's why I say it's overrated, because you hear people say, oh, you should use Arch because it's customizable. So is, like I said, Tumbleweed, Sleep, and Debian and Ubuntu, because you can find ways of installing a minimalistic way of it and build on top of that. Or with the SUSE world, you can customize it to the same degree as you can with Arch Linux via the installer. Oh, speed. Well, it's not even noticeably faster for most people. Specific use cases, probably. But for most people, you cannot feel it different. I can blindfold you, spin you around, and kick you in the balls, and we could be running a game or a program, and I'm like, what distribution are we running? I will guess that most hardcore Arch people would not be able to say that, oh, this is Arch Linux, this is Debian, and blah, 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 blah. They would have a really hard time predictably predict or tell you accurately what distribution you're using. Sometimes a blind squirrel finds nuts, you know. You get what I'm saying here, that it's not that unique anymore. It used to be, but not anymore. Anyway, I hope you guys get why Arch Linux is overrated. See you all later. Bye bye.